what's maybe the number one issue that CISOs are talking to you about?
I have a question for you. What do you think it is?
AI, something AI related. I mean, it's like the answer to literally everything.
You're so right. And so that is the number one question that I am getting right now.
This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell. And today on the show, we have Chelsea Smith. She is the Chief Executive Officer and Information Security Consultant at CAJ Cyber Consulting. They specialize in GRC with a focus on information security and business process analysis. Given that, that's a large part of the conversation that we had today. Some of the two or three use cases for analytics within cyber or cyber analytics. And so Chelsea has this analytics background as well as this cyber background, and she's merged those together as part of one of their services at her firm. So just talking about, hey, what do you typically see? What can we take away from your experience and apply in our roles in internal audit or external audit? The number one issue that she's been talking to her CISOs about, there is probably no surprise what that answer is, but we do go into more detail around that. And so I think there's a little bit extra there that you might not hear otherwise. As well as anytime we have a cyber person on the show, I always am interested to hear from them because I am not interested in cybersecurity. Like, it just does not make my brain happy at all. I will do what's necessary, but that's about it. And so I always like to ask them and pick their brain and go, hey, all right, what controls or tools or processes should I be following, i.e. the listeners as well, be following in our personal lives to make sure that we're staying secure relative to cyber risks. And then usually those roll over into our kind of 9-to-5 roles for the organizations we work with also. And so how can we take what Chelsea shares and apply it in our personal lives to make sure we're staying safe out there, as well as to mitigate those risks within our organization. Well, that's it. Here we go. I would imagine, so we were catching up on Altered Conference and the ISACA conference. So maybe you have something related to something you heard from those conferences in there, maybe not. But what is in either your internet browsing history or your ChatGPT history as of late? I'm going to lean actually and say ChatGPT history for you. I think you told me at one point you spend like 4 hours a day in ChatGPT. Is that right?
That is correct.
So what's not in your ChatGPT history is probably a better question for you.
That might be a good question, and I'm excited that you changed that a little bit, but I do have kind of a funny thing. Your browsing history should be empty. You should definitely be clearing that, hopefully relatively frequently. But yeah.
And you're saying that as a security person, right?
Yes, as a security person. Security, privacy, even though they're not the same thing, they are deeply related. So absolutely, I think that you should be clearing your browsing history mostly from a security perspective, but definitely from a privacy perspective as well.
Okay, I definitely don't do that. Why should I/anyone listening do that?
So if anyone were to get a hold of your browsing history, which is actually not uncommon, people like to click on things, and those things that they click on, sometimes we get a little click happy, and that's okay, to an extent, except for often that results in information or data being compromised in some way that we may not have necessarily expected. And so your browsing history may show places that you visit, maybe places that you have usernames and passwords. Maybe those usernames and passwords are used on other websites that may have more critical data. it just provides a lot of access to information that you don't necessarily want to share. So from a security standpoint, we definitely clear that. It's an automated feature in our browser tools. We push that out to all of our endpoints. So none of our employees' browsing history is maintained within the browser.
Got it. Okay, perfect. We're already getting into some good security stuff. All right. That aside, what's in your, we'll go with ChatGPT history for sure now.
Yeah. So I'm going to preface this just a little bit. So I started using ChatGPT back in 2022 when it first came out. And when I started using it, I was working at the University of Tennessee. I loved my time there. I taught a lot of courses, and those courses were related to emerging technologies, specifically related to how we implement those technologies into our business processes and how we protect them. And so I started using that because I thought, wow, everyone's going to start using this tool very, very soon. And we have to figure out, is it safe? How do we make it safe? And also, how do we protect the integrity of learning? How do we protect the integrity of information that's coming from it? And so it was a lot of fun to learn about this. And that's why I spent so many hours. So I already spent a lot of hours teaching and working and doing other things, but I taught a course in cybersecurity, for example, and every single topic I would think about, hey, do I know that I'm including all of the relevant information that I should be including relative to this topic? And so, for example, let's take identity and access management. I know so many things about identity and access management from reading way too many frameworks because apparently, I need a better free time or a hobby that is much better. But I read a lot of frameworks. What this allowed me to do was break down that topic into a mind map. And so we took access management and we thought about, oh my gosh, here are all the sub-subjects that you should consider when we think about access management as a whole. And here is everything you should think about relative to assigning an identity and making sure that it's unique. Here are all the methods of authentication. Just so you know, there's not 3, there's actually 7. And it just goes on. And you can use it as a tool. I like to say that it's not just artificial intelligence, it's thinking about it as a knowledge augmentation. I've heard other people say this as well. We use it to help us to learn faster than we would normally because we can do a Google search, but are those outputs the most efficient way to digest that information? So I use it as gap analysis. I used it for policy template development. I used it for process guidance. I used it for writing my emails because historically my emails, maybe they didn't include all the pleasantries. So it helped me make sure that they were nice and professional and included all of my thoughts in a clear and consistent manner. So my ChatGPT history would cover probably every single subject from a high level that you would see in any cybersecurity book for sure, but also IT audit, data analytics. We cover so many subjects. I also use it for training my staff. They have a lot of questions. They can't ask me those questions all the time. So we used a cybersecurity tutor. We built one of those and allowed them to ask those questions. If I'm not available, they still have a resource they can use. Now, just like in audit, we trust but verify. Yeah, that's something that a lot of people had to learn throughout the use of ChatGPT. We take that information that it provides and we think about, okay, how can I validate that this output is actually correct? So we verify that through other methods, but it's a good starting point for learning any new topic.
I like that. And that's how I largely use it also, and as well as writing scripts and things for analytics. But it does feel like I have a tutor sitting there with me as I do learn any new subject. And I think about when I was in public accounting and I had to send a message to the partner on the engagement. I was like, I don't understand. I think it was something to do with SOC reports. And I was like, SOC 1, SOC 2. I was like, I don't know what's going on with this. And I have to explain it to the assurance team. And so he wrote like in our IM, just like a book long message. And I went, yep, that's perfect. I got it now. But either way, this is a partner answering a pretty low level question. It was just, that's the person to ask though at that time. And so to think if we had just had our methodology in an LLM and I could have just sat there and talked to it and have asked it, that would have been a really good use case. I think you would definitely want to verify that because you wouldn't want to follow some procedure and go like, this is what the methodology says. And then PCOB be like, no, it doesn't, no, it does not say that. So I think, yeah, for sure. We're still all hopefully aware of those considerations, the hallucinations and things like that. So, well, I know when we first kind of started talking, so we actually met at an SICO event, I guess is where we first started talking, but then just in exchanging messages and trying to get this scheduled, you said something to the effect of we live our lives in sprints, because we were talking about, hey, could you do it this week or this week? And you're like, we live our lives in sprints. So we're flexible is the takeaway I had. But what did you mean by that? And what can you kind of give the listeners that they could apply to then live their lives, or at least maybe their professional lives, in sprints? And what's the benefit of that?
So the idea of living your life in sprints, we want to be flexible enough to where when things come up in life, we want to be able to address them when you're working on a project. And maybe that project has something come up that you did not expect. We want to make sure that we can address that and stay on track with our overall goals. And so as a business, when I saw you at that ISACA event, I was like, wow, I know this person and I've listened to his podcast. And not only that, I actually assigned it to my students when I was teaching at the University of Tennessee, because I think that it's important for them to learn how to keep up on current events relative to the subjects. So I think that's important that we remain flexible. We're willing to make changes as they are needed. All right. So how can other people make sure that they are able to live their life in sprints if they so choose? It's not a lifestyle for everyone. So the way we do it is we take everything that we have to do, whether that be a specific project, a client, if it's relative to our business goals, we literally take everything that's task related, project related, and we write it down. We then take each of those and we evaluate them on a weekly basis. During this weekly basis, we put all of these things in either backlog, we put it in sprint, in process, review, or done. So if you're familiar with like agile approach or Scrum, it's very much like that, where we move each task across the board until it's completed. At times, we may have to move something back to the sprint or back to the backlog if we have very important items that happen to come up throughout the process. And so at times, we just have to be flexible and be able to say, hey, we're going to make this change. We'll move this, what we had planned for this week, we're going to move it to a different week and take the opportunities that we have to accomplish, our overall goals.
Got it. All right. I appreciate that. I don't live my life in sprints, but definitely the 8 to 5 work life is definitely done so that way also. So I have an appreciation for that. That's why I wanted to ask you. And I think it can be really beneficial for a lot of folks who, I've probably told this story before, but I was on at a conference. There was a CAE panel, and one of the questions was something about Agile. And this one CAE just put his hand up. He's like, I'm not answering any questions about Agile. I'm so tired of hearing about that. Next question, and just went on. So I know people are tired of it, but my recommendation has always been, don't have to go like full Agile, but there's a lot of concepts in there that are very easy to understand. Something as simple as a Kanban board, like just do that piece, if nothing else. And it makes your life a lot easier and add some structure to it also. So anyway, I'm a fan of that approach. Also, appreciate you sharing your thoughts. Okay. So you're in cyber, and then within that also you have an analytics background, and so you've married those two together at your firm. What would you say are the top 2 to 3 use cases relative to cyber, what I'm going to call cyber analytics?
Yeah. So data analytics relative to cybersecurity has been around forever. Like, as long as I've been working in this business, so since we've had cybersecurity, we've collected data and analyzed that data to see how effective our security is. That being said, I feel like there are unlimited use cases, and we do so many. But if I had to pick the top 2 or 3 that we've been working on with our clients, I would have to say that risk management is definitely up there. For risk management, we ingest our data from our different inputs, such as business impact assessments, incident management, events that may occur, if an employee reports something, or with even like a change. Sometimes if we have business processes that maybe could run more smoothly. We also have inputs from our customers and our vendors, and we need a way to define what this data needs to be that should be feeding into our risk assessment so we can actually analyze the risks that are relative to our business. And we do that ingestion. We prioritize the risks based on which systems they tie to. So we integrate that with another analytics use case that I would say, supply chain risk management. So let's say that we have a vendor risk that comes up. Maybe it applies to our customer environment. And depending on the breadth of our systems and the impact that we may see, we can adjust that risk score and prioritize the actions that will be performed relative to addressing that risk in a timely manner. So I would say risk management is a huge one. And then also supply chain risk management. We use things like vendor scorecards, vendor assessments, either performed by external parties. We use their SOC reports. We use their penetration tests that they'll give them to us. And we ingest all of that data in order to understand a vendor's risk profile. And if they don't give us that data or any data relative to security, we ask ourselves how secure we think that they are. We also do.
How do you take this unstructured data and use it in a way that you can analyze it and produce some kind of quantifiable result?
Yeah, so that's the fun part, actually, for me. So we make it to where there's a few different ways, and it depends on the organization because we really focus on customizing our solutions. So one thing is we can use OCR and NLP technology. So this technology has the ability to basically read in a document and then translate it to a state where the computer recognizes it as text. And from there, we can then query the document itself to say, hey, did this particular client have any exceptions noted? I say client, vendor, have any exceptions noted that we should feed into our risk assessment? So we take that and we put it into a cell for analysis. So obviously, if it has exceptions noted, we're going to raise a flag. Anytime we have a flag raised, it's just something that we're going to follow up on. So even though there is still that human element piece where somebody's going to look at it, but it sees it so much faster than we would otherwise. But that's just one example. So we can also do a Google alert relative to security. And this is more for active monitoring, where let's say that the vendor and a series of specific words relative to security breach or privacy breach or something else happens, and we can ingest that information, and that can automatically create a record. So upon showing up in Google, it can generate an alert that will create a record in your security event file, and then you can do a manual evaluation of that vendor instead of the automated one that may be performed quarterly or annually based on your SLAs with your vendor. The third case that I would say is around identity and access management. So with identity and access management analytics, I'm trying to understand, is my user performing the task that he should be performing from the device that he should be performing in the location that he or she should be performing it at the time? So there's a lot of things that go in that we can actually create these data profiles for different individuals to understand, is this behavior that they're currently doing, does it indicate maybe risky behavior or behavior that is not necessarily supposed to be within their job parameters? And so there's so many things that we could use. I think that logging in from your work device is really essential because a lot of your work controls around protecting data are actually implemented on the endpoints that people are working from. So if you use a personal device, automatically that's exposing sensitive data to so much more than it would otherwise. So ensuring that it's on a work device, ensuring that they're in locations that are permitted. So a lot of companies actually require everything to be in the United States. And so it's super important to understand, hey, is my employee potentially traveling somewhere that would put the data at additional risk than it would otherwise? Am I meeting my compliance requirements by where they're accessing the data and what they're doing with that data?
So I'm sure you work with internal audit as well, but I got to think CISOs are your kind of the primary folks that you talk to. So what's going on in their head? What's maybe the number one issue that CISOs are talking to you about?
I have a question for you. What do you think it is?
AI, something AI related. I mean, it's like the answer to literally everything.
You're so right. And so that is the number one question that I am getting right now. How do I use AI? How do I protect AI when I do use it? How do I make sure my employees aren't using it? How do I include it within my implementations? How do I incorporate it in my business processes? They're all very concerned about utilizing AI and making sure that they're utilizing it in a safe and effective manner. And so what we've been doing is we've been actually working with CISOs to identify controls, a set of controls for their different applications, their different business processes. We look at controls relative to large language models. We look at controls relative to machine learning. We look at them relative to using them in development. We look at our AI models themselves and see the input, process, output, and see if we see any risk relative to that. And so we help companies think about what are the controls that we should implement, what guidances are available to see what controls are available, and how do I actually implement and document this, because we're going to see a large increase of these questions asked by not only our customers, our stakeholders, but our auditors as well. So we really need to be prepared for those questions and asking those questions on the front end.
Since this is the audit podcast and not the CISO podcast, what questions how should maybe a CAE approach that with their CISO? Is it as simple as asking the questions like, hey, how are we doing with this? Like, what are the risks that you're seeing? What if you stepped into like the CAE shoes, or from their perspective, how can they, maybe a better way to ask this, how can audit better facilitate those conversations or even bring them up, make them aware, and make sure that we're kind of good to go?
Well, I think the first thing is we have to see if we even have a policy. So whether that be the acceptable use policy relative to communicating to our employees, hey, you're allowed to use AI and this is the AI you're allowed to use, or you're not allowed to use AI in the workplace. I have seen both. But also you have to think about prohibiting or disallowing certain sites, or for whitelisting, making sure we're not including those within the whitelist. I think that you should always do a security review of any AI technology that's being performed. So from an audit perspective, I'm going to think about the scope of my systems that I have. I'm going to think about my employees. I'm going to think about how am I, one, communicating whether or not they're using AI, and how do I detect whether or not they're using AI. Because the biggest risk, I think, relative to this is that we see a lot of employees uploading sensitive data that we cannot and should not upload into these different tools. And we have to have a plan. That starts with starting the conversation with security, with IT, and then following up with a policy. Let's have some type of policy in place, if not multiple policies, depending on how or where we're implementing this new technology.
Okay, let's say that someone does upload sensitive data to some kind of AI tool. What is the risk there? Is it that the AI company itself now has access to it, or is it that someone could potentially, hack an AI company, or is it some kind of, I'll put like hack in quotes, but use some kind of prompt in order to get that type of data from the AI tool that they're being used? I mean, when we talk about risk, like what's the chances that, okay, I put this sensitive data in there and the likelihood of it actually being used or even obtained, what does that look like? And again, I say that with the kind of this caveat of whenever I talk about AI and using ChatGPT for analytics, et cetera, I always go, don't put your company info in there, talk to your CISO, make sure you're good. I always make sure but I mean, really, what's the risk? Is there a real world, situation that's happened that we can go, well, this company did it or this person did it and look what happened?
Well, I don't know that I have a specific example ready for you, but I have seen a multitude of news stories, and I wish that I had one at the top of my mind, but a multitude of stories where people have put this data into these systems. And a lot of the risks that you actually mentioned, hey, are these the potential risks? Yes, those are what we are seeing. An LLM tool that we're using that has ML working in the background is going to take the data that you have, and they're going to train their model based on that data. And so that data can then be exported as an output for another user. But additionally, I think that the risk relative to this is often we're storing very sensitive data in an unapproved location. We don't know the security background of these tools. We haven't done a third-party risk assessment. We don't know how vulnerable or how many vulnerabilities that these tools have. Now, if you have done that, cool. Like, you're ahead of most companies in America right now. But I think that it's incredibly important that we do a risk assessment before we use any of these tools. I think that there are several points of compromise. It's just like any other supply chain risk, right? So if we're going to put sensitive data into any tool, any application, any vendor tool, anytime we put this information in there, we have to realize that we're accepting that we're furthering our attack, our threat landscape, and we're also just accepting, additional risk to our organization. So you have to think about that. You have to think about how to protect the organization. You don't want to be releasing super sensitive data anywhere that is not an approved location.
Okay, appreciate that. Last thing on the security front, I'm going to ask you what the one thing is, but whenever somebody asks me, like, give me the one, whatever, I always go, cool, I'm going to give you two. So I'm going to ask for one, but feel free to just add however many makes sense. But what's the one-ish thing that we should be doing personally to mitigate cyber risk, like our personal lives, which I would assume would blend over into our work lives also. But what would that be? What's a control that we could implement maybe?
Perform risk assessments that are personal. So personal risk assessments. So for example, if you're going to download an app on your cell phone, you are going to see terms and conditions and probably a link to a privacy policy. And that tells everyone, hey, this is exactly what data we're collecting from your network, from your device, from your other profiles. And here's where we're going to send it. And here's how long we'll keep it. And here's what we're going to use it for. And often they disclose all of that in plain text and nobody reads it. And that's a choice, but you have to be ready to accept the consequences of that choice. You could be agreeing to quite a few things that you probably didn't feel like you wanted to agree to. So I think doing a risk assessment, and that includes things like, hey, let's go back through the applications that I do have on my personal devices, and let's take a look at if maybe I've reused passwords. Let's not do that. Do I have two-factor authentication utilized and enabled on my specific application that I'm using? I think those things are really, really important to ensure that things don't get compromised. A lot of times we think, oh, it's not important. It's not that serious. And time again, we see these news stories where it in fact is that serious. It has ruined so many people's lives. And it's the easiest thing that you can do is make sure you're not reusing passwords, make sure that you're using secure methods to authenticate and, rotate those passwords periodically. And I know that can be a lot, but again, use some service, make sure you're deleting accounts that you don't use, don't keep those around. Your password probably exists in so many places that you are unaware, but I promise you, if somebody cared enough, they could find it, and you don't want that.
So it is 2024, seemingly like the age of AI, and still when it comes to security, the number one recommendation is good, strong password controls. Is that right?
I thought you were going to say good, strong password, and I was going to be like, good, strong authentication controls, I think is the way that I would say it. Good, strong authentication controls. Make sure that, you can lock a lot of these things down to, hey, only this device, and only if I authenticate using this authentication app. That's only on this device.
Perfect. Yeah, I think authentication makes more sense than password control, so that's good. All right, that's perfect. Okay, a lot of good stuff. I always like the practical advice, how to do this, how to do that, and especially in the AI and security world. And then we touched on analytics a little bit in there also. So for me, anytime I can walk away from any of these conversations and go, yep, I learned something, that's great, and I can go apply it, I'm appreciative of that, and I'm sure the audience is also. With that said, is there anything else that you want to leave the audience with today?
Yes, absolutely. So when I started IT Audit, I don't think that I fully appreciated or understood the need for data analytics. I don't think from a cybersecurity perspective, when I first learned cybersecurity, I don't think I fully understood the need for data analytics. And so real quick, we're going to just talk through. Here's how we figure out what we're going to do, what we're going to analyze. So first thing, you need to identify the problem or the goal. All right. What am I trying to achieve? What business process are we trying to do? What information do I need in order to be successful? So number one, we're going to identify the problem or the goal. Number two, we're going to figure out what data I need to answer that question. Do I have access to it? Where is it? How do I pull it? How do I extract it from a system? If I need to do some type of cleansing of the data, how is that going to take place? And then how can I aggregate all of that data and normalize that data in one location? And sometimes you have to pull in people that specialize in this, but hopefully you have access to data analytics teams that can help you with this. So once we figure out what's the problem, how do we extract, transform, and load that data? How do I get access to that data? We're then going to perform some type of analysis. And so this is where we need to know, okay, we've got the data, we've cleaned it. That's 90% of the work, believe it or not. Now, how are we going to use this to answer a question? And sometimes that is using just standard diagnostic analytics, but sometimes it's machine learning, AI. Sometimes we use it to help us to make decisions. And then once we perform that analysis, we're going to output that in some way that's useful. So I like to say that people learn different ways. So make sure that I would perform some type of visual, perform some type of report, and, make that information as succinct and clear as possible. And then ask for feedback. Is this what you had expected? Does this solve the problem? And that can produce a real cycle of, making sure that we have effective audit and effective analytics in our cybersecurity as well.
Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.